Hey guys, what's up? In the following videos, we will learn how to create rendered animations using Enscape. But before we dive into Enscape, it's important to understand that when we talk about any kind of animation, we are basically dealing with an image sequence that is displayed so fast that eludes our brain, and we think the objects within the sequence are in fact moving around. The process of creating animated videos in Enscape is very similar to the one in SketchUp and follows the basic principles of animation. One of the main advantages of using the computer in any kind of animation is that it creates the interpolation between frames. In other words, we create strategic frames called keyframes, and the computer is responsible for generating all the other frames automatically, whereas in traditional animation we would have to draw or generate every single frame of the animation. So talking about Enscape, we will have to define strategic keyframes, which will save the camera's position, and Enscape will calculate all the other in-between frames, generating a path for the animation that will guide the camera's movement along our scene. So to start our exercise, I am using here this Villa Savoye model, and first of all I have to turn on Enscape. Okay, I will increase a little bit the size of this window since I'm not going to use the SketchUp viewport in this example. And the first step to create any kind of animation is to click the video editor button right here. And you can also use the V shortcut for that. And here in the video editor, we have some parameters we can toggle. For example, we can turn on and off these grid lines that can be very helpful for the composition process. I'll turn it off for now. We can also check the length of the animation, which is 0, since we don't have any kind of animation till now. We can also see that we have this movement controls that can interfere in the camera's movement, and I won't change anything at the moment. And underneath we have the keyframes of the animation, but since we don't have any kind of animation, we still don't have any keyframe. In this exercise, I would like to create a very simple walkthrough along the Villa Savoye model, and first of all, I will have to create a starting point for this animation. I suggest that we press the space bar, so we shift to the walking mode. I can also shift to this mode by pressing this button up here and change from flying mode to walk mode, since I don't want to fly along my model but walk. I can then try to find an interesting angle to start my animation, and if I am happy with this angle, I can create my first keyframe either by pressing the K, or I can also click this plus icon, and you can notice that there is one plus icon here on the left side and one on the right side, and there is a difference between them, but for now I can click in any of them that I will create my first keyframe in the same manner. So I will click this button here, and if I do so, Enscape creates a keyframe. So there is one point that appears here, showing that there is a keyframe right here, saving the camera's current position and direction. Now I will move along my scene, and my suggestion is to use the WASD keys, and we can also keep the left mouse button pressed, and we can walk around our model. We can also use the Shift key or the Control key to speed up our camera movement. And if by any chance we fly a little bit, we can always press the space bar to once again land on the ground. And I would like to get very close to the entrance door, somewhere here. And now I will create my second keyframe, which will save this current position. So I can press once again the plus button, and we can now notice that we have a second keyframe that was positioned in the end of the animation. And we have in fact created an animation that lasts 18 seconds containing 2 keyframes. If I click on the first keyframe, I'll go back to the first position, and if I click on this second keyframe, I'll return to the keyframe that I just created, and if I click this preview button, we can already see the animation, which is basically the transition between these two frames. So all the interpolation was created by Enscape, and that's why the computer is very useful when we work with any kind of animation. Okay, so let's say that now I would like to extend this animation, and after looking at the entrance door, I would like to walk along the right corridor of the Villa Savoye. So I will change my camera view to the right side. I can press the W key to walk a little bit, and I'll try to find here some interesting angle that I can now check this corridor. I can then click once again this plus button here, and you can then notice that a third keyframe was created and the second keyframe moved a little bit to the left. So now we have a first keyframe that is the starting point of our animation, a second keyframe that is very close to the entrance door, and a third keyframe that gives us a view of Villa Savoye right corridor. And if we hit the play button, I can check my new animation with 3 keyframes. It's important also to notice that we can move through our keyframes by clicking on top of them, but we can also use these 2 buttons here that will shift through the keyframes. And whenever we select a keyframe, it's displayed here its number and its attributes that we can later configure if we would like so. Okay. So we just figured that it's not so hard to create animations in Enscape. We can basically create specific keyframes, and then we'll have an animation that will move along these keyframes. However, let's say we would like to make small adjustments to the keyframes we've just created. For example, let's say I wouldn't like to get so close to the entrance door. One way to change this would be to click on the second keyframe so that we can see the camera's position and direction. And here we can basically define a new position to the camera. I'll press the S key to move my camera a little bit backwards so I won't be so close to this entrance door, somewhere here. And now to make Enscape save this new information, I have to click this button here called Update. So it will update the information of the camera in this keyframe. And if I return to the first keyframe and hit the play button, I will notice that now the camera's movement will be a little bit different. The camera won't get so close to the entrance door, but it will continue to turn to the right side of Villa Savoye model and finish in the same position as it was previously. Okay, so it's not so hard to make changes in our keyframes. We basically have to select them, define a new position, and remember to click the update button. But let's say that now I would like to create new keyframes between existing keyframes. For example, let's say that I would like to create a new position for the camera after it leaves the starting point and before it reaches the entrance door view. We have actually 2 methods that we can use. One method would be basically to select this new position. For example, I could move my camera somewhere here, and basically we can move our mouse somewhere between the 2 existing keyframes, and we will notice that there is now a plus icon that we can click, and it will create a new keyframe in this position. And it's not so hard to do it. But there is another way of doing this, which I actually consider more interesting. That would be first to check the camera's path and then create a new keyframe. To check the camera's path, we can click this button called Exit Keyframe. When we click this button, or we can also use the ESC key, we leave this keyframe mode, and now we can see the camera's path. This is actually a very good way to understand better what is happening in our animation, since here we can see exactly the path in which the camera is moving, and we can also see the keyframes. So this first camera represents the first keyframe. Here we have the second one, and here we have the third one. And in between them, we have this path. And if we click in any of these keyframes, we will actually select the keyframe, and we will once again move to the view of this camera in this keyframe. So if we would like to go back to the other mode of visualizing the animation, we can once again press ESC, and we can check once more the camera's path and the keyframe in this kind of view. And when we are in this other mode, we can create new keyframes basically by clicking along the path. So let's say I would like to create a new keyframe between the first and the second keyframe. I can basically click somewhere here, and you can notice that a new keyframe appeared between the first and the second. And since we have this keyframe selected, we are now in this camera view, and we can make the adjustments that we like. For example, I would like to move my camera a little bit to the left, maybe a little bit forward, and maybe now I can look a little bit to the right. And when we are happy with this new camera position, we have to remember to click the update position. So now this keyframe here is storing this information that I just defined. And now if I press the ESC key, or click here in this exit keyframe, I can now check that I actually created a new keyframe in between the first and the second keyframe, and now the camera will move a little bit to the left side of the model, and then it will continue with the previous path that we created. And now if I hit the play button, I will see that the changes that I've made will change this path, generating a different walkthrough than the one we created before. Okay, and actually this new keyframe that I've just created was just an example, and I don't want it anymore. So whenever we want to delete any kind of keyframe, we can basically select it by clicking directly on the path, or we can also select the keyframe in the timeline underneath, and we can click here the delete button, and now our path will return to its previous state without this new keyframe. Okay, so we've just learned how to create new keyframes between the existing keyframes, and we can do so by clicking directly on the path, or we can also click underneath in the timeline, so it's actually not so hard. But let's say that now I would like to create a new keyframe before the first keyframe that already exists in our animation. In this case, we have to notice that we have two plus icons, one on the left and one on the right. We've actually used until now the one on the right, and when we click on this button, what actually is happening is that Enscape is creating a new keyframe after this last one, extending the length of the animation. So if I choose any angle here and I basically press this plus button and zoom out, I will notice that we've just created a new keyframe in this position that I just chosen, and it extended the animation by creating this new part of the path. So if I don't want this keyframe anymore, I can basically select it and click the delete button. But if we want, on the other side, to create a keyframe before the first one, we have to use this left plus icon button. So let's say we would like to create a new position for the camera somewhere here. So I'll choose the position. Okay. And now if I click this plus button on the left side, Enscape will create a new keyframe here. I can zoom out to check it out. And I can see that now my animation will start at this point, and if I press play, it will continue to the other keyframes that existed previously. Okay, I'll press the ESC button and I'll click on this keyframe and I will delete it because I don't want it as well. And now I return to my previous path with my previous animation. And in the following videos, we will learn how we can change the length of the animation, also change some cameras parameters, and obviously how can we generate the final rendered animation of this model.